The Data Nerd, Episode 4, The Importance of Data Literacy. Where you're on the data literacy spectrum does matter, but also your role does matter too.
My thinking around this has really shifted in the sense that I think that it's really helpful to have data literacy sort of be the foundation of the house, if you will, so that everybody can speak the same language and understand what needs to happen.
Welcome to the Data Nerd Podcast. I'm your host, Nisar Ahmed. Join me as we explore the inner data nerd inside all of us. Dive into the world of data alongside special guests who not only share their wealth of experience and knowledge, but also unveil what truly makes them data nerds. This podcast is brought to you by Business Intelligence. That's BIZNIS Intelligence. You can subscribe to my YouTube channel at Business Intelligence to stay up to date with Tableau training and the Data Nerd podcast. Connect with me on LinkedIn or stream the Data Nerd podcast across all major podcast platforms. Welcome to the Data Nerd podcast. Today I have the pleasure of meeting or presenting our guest, Cait Sojka. Cait is a good friend of mine. Actually, we met last year at Tableau conference. That's how we got introduced. And she's been, we've been keeping in touch ever since. But just a little bit about Cait's background. For the last 3 years, Cait has been the lead analytics trainer at Lovelytics and has provided more than 1,000 students from 100 different companies with data analytics training. She is Tableau Desktop Analyst Certified, a certified Tableau subcontracted instructor, and is Alteryx Designer Core and Advanced Certified. Cait is a member of the Austin Tableau User Group Advisory Board, is in the top 4% of Tableau Community Forum Best Answer Leaders, and was a speaker at last year's conference where I met her. Cait recently accepted an offer to join Visa as the new manager of Tableau Dashboard Development, and she will begin her new adventure on March 26th. So welcome, Cait, and congratulations on your new job as well.
Thanks so much. Yeah, really excited to start it out and see how it goes.
Awesome. Yeah, I know we met last year at Tableau conference, and and I think that's one of the good things about the conference. It's not just the learning, but the people you meet, right, and the connections you make. And I'm so glad that we were able to connect there, and this relationship has been fruitful for both of us, I hope.
Yeah, absolutely. It's been so great. It's wild to think that almost a whole year already has gone by. But
That's true. It's been a whole year.
yeah, time over here flying.
It does. So, but what I like to do is before we start, I always ask my guests, this is a data nerd podcast, and I like to ask everyone if they are a data nerd. And if so, tell me your story when you realized you are one.
Yeah, absolutely a data nerd for sure. I think I started out just like as a regular nerd and then, eventually incorporated the data aspect into it. So I started out the first 6 years of my career working in the nonprofit sector, which, have had sort of an interesting meandering career path since then. But I think it was in that environment really realizing how much I cared about making data-driven decisions. I think so many nonprofits do absolutely incredible work, but I think a lot of them, especially like the more local ones, really operate in this kind of like feels-based environment where it's like, oh, but it feels like the right thing to do. And so I feel like for me, it definitely was having that experience and realizing like, oh, the power of actually being able to justify decisions that we were making based on data and outcomes and being able to test for those sorts of things. So I think that was my sort of initial dipping my toes into the data nerd world, but I've expanded a lot since then.
Yeah, that's awesome. I think in the nonprofit sector, and I also, I don't work in nonprofit, but I help out with certain
Yeah,
nonprofit organizations, and Tableau is huge in the nonprofit sector.
absolutely.
I think they even have sessions dedicated to nonprofit at Tableau conference, if I'm not mistaken.
Yeah, no, they
Uh,
absolutely do. They have a Tableau user group specifically for
yes.
like government and nonprofit users. Tableau, back in the day before the acquisition, actually, I got to be a part of this initiative. Tableau Foundation actually used to provide in-kind pro bono work for nonprofits that were part of their like key strategic global initiative areas. So in terms of literally like complete solutions engineering, data engineering, any kind of like Tableau doctor type sessions
Yeah.
on a yearly mentorship basis. So it was really cool to be a
Yeah.
part of that, and definitely something I think that Tableau continues to really value.
Yeah, they really highlight the community involvement and giving back to the community. So it's great that Tableau takes those initiatives and those steps as well. And then, along the lines of training, right? I know you've talked about your experience in training. You also worked on Tableau e-learning, right? Part of developing some of the content on e-learning?
Definitely. So basically, the initiative that we did was like developing e-learning content through Lovelytics.
Mm.
So we ended up not launching that to the public. It's something that we use on like a proprietary basis for our customers. But yeah, and definitely like while at Tableau, obviously like helping overall with that. Yeah, kind of like
Yeah.
e-learning process. Absolutely.
Yeah. And I mean, training in general is your bread and butter, right? That's what you do.
Yeah.
And I don't know if will you be doing some still continue with the training in your new job, or is it more just
Yeah,
hands-on work?
I'm really excited. It was kind of in terms of the role, they'd kind of like outlined like some nice to haves, right? Is like, oh, they'd really love to have somebody that could also deliver enablement sessions and things like that. And I was like, oh, wow. Well, as it turns out, that's something I'm super passionate about. So it definitely seems like, in addition to kind of more the dashboard building,
Mhm.
requirements gathering, data engineering side of things, that I'll get an opportunity to continue
Yeah, that's
empowering
great.
people
Like you
with
don't want
data.
to lose that. I mean, I love teaching and training because
Yeah.
it's very satisfying and it's different than doing work. So it's great that you can continue on doing some of that as well.
Yeah, absolutely.
So today's topic, what we want to talk about, and is data literacy. I believe your topic last year at the conference was kind of related to this, or was it? It was more along the lines of like best practices, or was it right?
Yeah, a lot of it. So our session last year was like 10 steps to user-friendly design. So it was really focused on helping end users understand what they're seeing. So definitely a strong aspect of data literacy in that component, really from a front end perspective.
Got you. Yeah. So when it comes to data literacy, can you maybe tell us, or for those of us who don't know, like what is data literacy and why it's so important?
Yeah. So I think the definition I've really internalized for data literacy is one I kind of pulled from Salesforce, right? It just in having participated in all of their internal like train the trainer initiatives and things. So I would define data literacy as the ability to explore, understand, and communicate with data. So those are really like the three pillars that I think of when I bring data literacy to mind. But overall, right, it's really just making sure that people understand what data is, where it comes from, and how they can use it to make data-driven decisions.
So different organizations obviously have different levels of data literacy, not just at an organization level, but just individuals who work for different companies, right? Some people are more
Mhm.
data literate than others, right? So how can individuals and organizations assess what their level is? Like, how do you know what level you're at?
Yeah, absolutely. So there's definitely like two sort of more formalized resources that I like to point people to. So one is from the Data Literacy Project. If you Google it, like
Mhm.
Data Literacy Project Assessment, there's actually a test that they've put together that both for individuals and organizations that kind of helps them, get a good baseline as to where they're at. And same at dataliteracy.com, Ben Jones, who I've had the pleasure of meeting with, actually talked to him. He was a great inspiration and resource when putting together actually a data literacy training through Lovelytics.
Mhm.
His organization also provides an assessment for individuals and for organizations that does the same thing. I think it's incredibly helpful to get a baseline understanding of okay, where are we starting from? Do people understand what data is? Do they understand what our data looks like? Do they understand like why we even are talking about data? Or are they ready maybe for like some more advanced topics, like really getting into the nuts and bolts of maybe statistical analysis or things like that?
So does it give you a score when you go there? It gives you an actual like a
Yeah,
score like
like an actual
ABC
score.
or a 1 to
Yeah,
100 score?
yeah, I think it's numeric. I don't think it's like a letter grade. But
Okay.
yeah, it will give you kind of like a numeric score. And then I haven't taken the one from the data literacy project in a while, so I'm not, they may have changed like the format. But it'll also kind of start to give you like a general grading, if that makes sense. Like if you're
Mm,
in like, like a novice to an expert level type thing. And then there's some follow-on resources too for both organizations as to like different courses that you could take or different resources that they provide. Obviously, kind of a mixture of like paid and free resources there. But I
yeah.
think it's a good benchmark to really understand where folks are at. And then especially from an organization perspective, you can really, concentrate efforts in the areas where people might not be that strong.
No, that's great. I mean, I think that's a good way to start because you may not know what level you're at, right? And whether you're at the lower end or the higher end of the spectrum, I'm assuming the way that you would improve data literacy would be different depending on
Yeah.
who you're trying to train, right? So can you
Mhm.
talk a little bit about what strategies you may employ to improve data literacy, regardless of what end of the spectrum you're on?
Yeah, absolutely. So I like to think of just as like a high level, really there being kind of like four pillars of data literacy, if you will. So the first is understanding just data sources and data structure. Do I know where data, especially like maybe organization or individually specific, is coming from? Like where does the data even live, right?
Mm,
And then what structure is it in? I think that that's really important for people to understand so that they can have a good idea of what data exists, what data doesn't exist, and what options we might have for actually analyzing that data. Because obviously, and I like to joke around, right? A lot of customers that I've worked with in the past, it's like the box of receipts, right? Where they're like, oh, great, I have all this data. And it's like, going to be really hard to analyze, a bunch of loose paper objects and things. So really getting a good understanding of that. The second pillar beyond data sources and data structure would be understanding aggregation and granularity in data. The idea that for any type of data analysis that we're doing, like whether it's on a computer or even if we're just literally doing it by hand, that the difference between sort of a row level compute on data versus rolling rows of data up and why that matters, how we would think about doing that, and how that impacts actually what we're analyzing. The third pillar, and I think that this one really comes up as we start to see more maturity in organizations where they're using something like a Power BI or a Tableau or a ThoughtSpot, right,
mm,
for visual analytics purposes, is understanding how to read charts. What does this chart show me? What does this chart not actually show me? What conclusions could I draw from this chart? What conclusions could I not draw from this chart, right? And then if we're, data practitioners, why would I choose a certain chart? What purpose do charts serve? And really making sure we're choosing the right chart type to display the data. And then the last piece is really just basic statistics. I think that there's this understanding from a lot of data practitioners, it just becomes sort of like incorporated maybe into the work that we do. And there's a lot of assumptions being made that your average person knows what linear regression is, knows what
mm,
nonlinear regression is, right? Understanding standard deviations and what would be statistically significant. And unfortunately, I think that that's probably much never the case, that
yeah.
people understand what the data actually signifies or what conclusions could we draw from that data. So I would say those are like the main four things. And so depending on where somebody's strengths are, I would say focusing in on whatever area they may feel like they have a gap. So if they're like, yeah, I've been using Tableau for a long time, I understand how to pick a chart type, but maybe they don't understand the logic that Tableau uses under the hood for
Yeah.
different types of analytics, right?
Yeah, and so that's a good point because you talked about, I think you brought in a lot of not just where you're at in data literacy, but what's your role at the
Mm,
organization. And you
yeah.
talked about everyone from like data engineers to end users to developers or people who are building in business intelligence, whatever tool they're using, right?
Mhm.
Sometimes you take for granted your data literacy knowledge or lack thereof. So for
Yeah.
example, I work in Tableau. I would assume that I'm hired to work in Tableau and develop, that I know that I'm very data literate.
Mm,
But not all Tableau developers are the same.
yeah.
There are some people who actually they're very good technically, and they know how to create whatever charts or graphs or calculations they need to, but the way that they display it
Hmm.
is maybe does not follow some of the best practices, right?
Yeah.
And so where you're on the data literacy spectrum does matter, but also your role does matter too, right? So do you, when you're training or you're trying to teach data literacy, do you put everyone like in the same room together from technical to non-technical staff and then train them all together, or does it make sense to kind of segment them out?
Yeah, that's a great question. So, my perspective on this in particular, like I would say more than anything else, has shifted wildly over the last 3 years. I used to think that the best approach was to segment people out by their role and to not like really, get too deep in the weeds in any one area. But my thinking around this has really shifted in the sense that I think that it's really helpful to have data literacy sort of be the foundation of the house, if you will, so that everybody can speak the same language and understand what needs to happen. I think what I've experienced or seen in working with customers over the past 3 years in particular is the siloing that happens in a lot of organizations because, rightly so, you have folks that are better with certain products or procedures and things like that. So, for example, data engineers spending a lot of time working in SQL in a data warehouse, not really being the same person that's building dashboards in Tableau, right?
Hmm.
But the problem that I see is that there's sort of this like miss or lack of common understanding. And so a lot of times it's like folks are presenting data in a certain way, even if they're choosing the right chart type and it's visually aesthetic, that it doesn't accurately represent the data that actually has been curated, or vice versa, that data engineers don't understand maybe what the end user's goals or uses of the data are. And so then it becomes really difficult for them to curate a data set that meets those needs because they aren't really speaking a common language. So I've really shifted over the past couple of years, and we've started offering training holistically. So where we would literally have, obviously, like capping the number of students, right? So it could be interactive, but
Yeah.
having like cohorts of end users combined with maybe developers or things like that, combined with data engineers, so that everybody can be on the same page of like, what does our particular organization's data look like? And again, how can that data be used? What questions could we answer? And what questions can we not answer? Right.
Yeah, and I think that's a great way to go about it because the business users sometimes can be very non-technical. And
Hmm.
the more they can understand what's available, then the better they can be at maybe asking for what they need.
Yeah. Or I think the other benefit too is like a lot of times data comes from end users, right? Where they're like salespeople
Yeah.
or whoever it may be, right?
They're
Actually
managing the data, right? They're managing the input of the data.
exactly. And so I find that in a lot of organizations, they struggle with compliance around that, right? So it's like salespeople are supposed to input, these 10 fields. Sometimes they're doing 3 fields, sometimes they do all 10, most of the time they don't. And the information that they're putting in, it's like kind of haphazard or half done, right? And
And then
so
who has to fix that then, right?
And then the end users come back and say, well, I want to know X, Y, and Z. And so then we have this discrepancy again. Well, it's like, well, I can't tell you what that is because you didn't fill out the fields, right?
Yeah.
Or you filled it out, but not in the way that we're asking for. So I find that the more that end users can understand the fact that data only exists, right, for analysis, if
Yeah.
it's been input into the system, I think really helps like sort of build this camaraderie and just overall understanding of, oh, like you can't build me a chart or dashboard that helps me analyze all of my sales opportunities if I'm not capturing all the details about my sales opportunities or whatever the particular use case is. I have a background in sales, so I think that
Yeah.
that's where my brain goes. But obviously, this would be true across the board, right?
Yeah. Yeah. I mean, and you can't make up data, right? If the data is there, it's there. And so if they understand the importance
Yep.
of entering the data correctly or being
Yep.
in compliance with the way they're entering the data, then it makes
Yep.
everyone's job easier.
Absolutely. And so, yeah. And so then it saves time on the back end in terms of this like massive data cleanup. And it helps, I think, from looking at an end to end perspective, also identify opportunities for streamlining processes or for back end improvements, right? Where it's like, okay, the salespeople don't want to fill all this in because every single field is a text box and they're having to spend a bunch of time typing things in. Okay, well, I, as a database engineer, right, or whatever
Mhm.
title you have, I can fix that, right? I can preload values into those fields to make those check boxes instead. It's going to save you a lot of time, but now I'm getting the data in the format that I need, and you're putting in the data that you actually want to be able to understand.
Yeah,
So,
it goes both ways, right? It's
yeah,
not just the business users or end users. Also, you can make their job easier, right? Maybe
yeah,
they're not filling everything in because it's hard for them to do. And so
yep,
you need to
exactly.
understand both sides as well to in order to
Yeah.
something. Yeah.
Absolutely. And just, I think, even helping them understand too, like the idea of statistical significance. I think this is one I keep coming back to. I saw this amazing post by Steve Wexler. His company's called, I think, Data Revelation.
Mm,
Um, so he had posted basically, there was a Makeover Monday challenge that was great. It was about like, um, people in the United Kingdom setting New Year's goals, like the difference between what men prioritize for New Year's resolutions versus what women did. And Steve basically pointed out, he's like, hey, this is great. But when we actually look at the underlying data, it came from a study that did not have a significant amount of people, like enough people answering it, right? Where it's like,
mm,
okay, 40% of the people from overall that they polled said that they did make New Year's resolutions. So instead of it being like they had done an original like sampling, I think it was like 1,000 or 2,000 people. Don't quote me on that exact number. But so it's like, okay, only 40% of those people even made resolutions. Now we're down to a sample size of 400 people. Okay, well, only 20% of people within that 400 said that they actually do these things. And like, is the difference between 80 people doing something and 82 people doing something statistically significant? It's like, not
yeah.
so much,
Yeah.
right?
Yeah.
And so I loved that post because I think that it just really addresses the fact that, and this happens in organizations too, not just like for fun data challenges, but in real organizations, it's like, oh, like this marketing campaign or this sales effort or this new drug or whatever we're developing. It's like, is it actually having the impact that we think if we're not getting a big enough population that we're testing against, right? So it's
Yes.
like sending an email out to 100 people sounds like a lot when you're one salesperson, but the difference between, 50 people or 52 people opening an email, it's like that's not actually statistically significant.
Yeah, and then you don't want to start making decisions based off of that, small sample size, because then you might
Exactly.
be going down the wrong path.
Yeah, exactly. And I think too, yeah, even just understanding that idea of like A B testing, right? That we don't just test one thing because it works. It's like we need to be evaluating multiple different options, in order to validate that the change that we made is what's driving that. And it's not just some random correlation. So
Yeah.
yeah.
Yeah. So let's talk a little bit about the culture of data literacy, right? How do you foster a culture within an organization? Some people may be on board with it. Some people may think it's useless or they don't want to do it. Right? And
Yep.
so how do you, particularly amongst the non-technical staff, I think probably that's probably the group that may not want to participate in some data literacy training.
Yep. I have seen this repeated like over and over and over, right? And I think that the single most important thing that I would say, and I think that there are a lot of studies that have been published. I think Forrester had a study on this, but is the idea of getting executive buy-in, right? It
Hmm.
really comes from the top, and at a certain level, you could have an amazing like grassroots involvement from end users and data stewards and things like that within an organization. But if your C-level folks don't think that it's a priority, don't think it's important, it's really not going to get any traction, especially because at the end of the day, I think that there needs to be this sponsorship, this understanding that taking time, money, effort, whatever it may be, in order to provide data literacy training is going to obviously impact like sort of bottom line activities, right? But overall, with the understanding that, okay, if we can adopt these principles and practices, it's really going to drive future success for the organization. So, short term loss, right, in terms of productivity is really going to provide a long term gain. So I would say for the executives out there,
Mm,
definitely take some time to even talk to other folks in your industry, right? There's so many amazing resources like Tableau user groups or Alteryx user groups or whatever it may be. And I know those are kind of product specific, but generally speaking, I think that they do a great job of fostering community, like kind of like you did for us, right? Like introduce yourself at some sort of data event, right?
yeah.
So many of them. I know Data Tune is either happening this week or just happened in Nashville, right? Like there's so many amazing South by Southwest happening in Austin this weekend, right? So many amazing opportunities to have just sort of like thought leadership and engagement with other folks in a similar industry or similar size
Mm.
business. And so I would really encourage folks that are in sort of leadership positions to do that work to see what the benefit has been for organizations that are early adopters of data literacy practices. And I would say to all like the little people like myself out there, right, that are like kind of low on the totem pole, that really making sure that any efforts that y'all are engaging in have some sort of visibility at the C level. So making sure that the conversations that are happening that we're really kind of driving or emphasizing the like what's in it for me for the executives, right? How is this going to benefit the business? What's going to be able to come to fruition because of these efforts? And so not just seeing it as sort of this expense, but really as a benefit.
Training is important, right?
Yeah.
It fosters learning, continuous development, and especially in data literacy, right? So,
Mhm.
and that brings up my next question: like, what role does education and training play in enhancing data literacy? And how can organizations particularly support ongoing learning, right? This is not just a one-time thing, right? It's you learn, but then you want them to then apply that in their
Mhm.
roles and then continue to learn. And so can you talk a little bit about how you can how education is important and how you can continue with ongoing support in with educating in data literacy?
Absolutely. Yeah. And kind of like womp womp. We would have gotten to present a tablet conference with our presentation, but just overall, really seeing enablement as kind of this like three-legged stool, right? Regardless of what you're trying to teach. In this case, obviously applying it to data literacy, but the idea that you would have some aspect or combination of live training, ongoing training resources that would be available, maybe in like e-learning or user groups or things like that. And then some sort of mentorship. So making it possible for folks that are further along on the path to actually really come alongside the newbies, right? To help answer their questions and to show them maybe some nuances that apply specifically to the industry or to their role or to their department that would be really hard to grasp in kind of just a boilerplate sort of training opportunity. So that's definitely, I would recommend, if folks are trying to set up some sort of data literacy or other type of technical enablement at their organization, making sure that there's at least one component from each of those buckets in order to have ongoing success. And I think overall, just recognizing the having folks recognize just the level of fun
Mhm.
that maybe we could bring to the overall picture, right? So I really have been enjoying the way that I think enablement concept has shifted maybe over the past couple of years, and bringing in pieces of things like gamification, right? The ability to earn badges or certifications, right? Human brains, we love small victories, right? I
Mm.
think most of us can agree that when we're learning any new thing, if we don't have at least some small success in the initial phases, we're like, nah, I give up, right? So being able to bring in that element of just lighthearted competitiveness, maybe nothing too serious or cutthroat, right? No like work
Yes.
Squid Games or anything like that, but definitely a level of, baseline competition, and then small rewards along the way that is combined with recognition. I think that recognition piece also really big for a lot of folks, that their manager or their peers or even, again, like executive level folks would be able to see and recognize the efforts and the progress that they're making. I think would go a long way.
Yeah, I know. And for those who don't know, Kate and I submitted to speak at Talbot Conference on this topic, actually, training training end users. Did not get selected this time, but we can always try again for next year, hopefully. Fingers
Yeah,
crossed.
absolutely. And if nothing else, maybe we'll include a little like snippet of it or something in some sort of future data nerd podcast.
Yeah, and we could take a snippet of this podcast and submit it.
Yeah,
Yeah, it's
absolutely.
great. No, this is great. Great topic. I think is very important. And what you talked about going to different groups and participating. And you know what I see in these data meetups or even at conferences is it's not just technical staff that are going. You see executives or business users going, which is great. I think it's
Mhm.
amazing because everyone's seeing the importance and the value of data.
Yeah,
Yeah.
absolutely. And I think it's one of those few environments where the general sort of like veil of secrecy, if you will, especially between competitors in similar industries, right? That there's this opportunity to have conversations where it's like, oh, your organization is doing this or trying to do this. Mine's interested in that as well. So being able to interface live with folks, really, really a great opportunity and something I would recommend. Definitely worthwhile.
Yeah, completely agree. So this is great, Kate. How can people get in touch with you?
Yeah, LinkedIn, absolutely the best. I'm on there every day. So it's just like my first and last name, which I'm sure will be somewhere available in this podcast.
Yep,
So
I'll post it in the
definitely.
description for this podcast so everyone can connect. But thank you, Kate, for joining. And this was a great conversation. And, we'll keep in touch. We'll continue talking, continue working together.
Absolutely. Yeah, looking forward to seeing you at TC here in a little bit. And I hope you have a great rest of your weekend.
Awesome. Thank you, Kate.
Bye, Nassar.